and welcome to the first episode of Obiter, the new Durham University Pro Bono Society podcast. Thank you for listening. My name is Stacey Stroud.
And I'm Jabreed Kaur. Today we'll be discussing the death penalty, and this week is Death Penalty Awareness Week at Durham University. And we have here with us Shobha Padmanabhan from the Durham University Pro Bono Society Amicus project, and Mr. Alexander William from the Durham Law School.
Okay, so Shobha, do you want to tell us a little bit about Death Penalty Awareness Week?
Well, it all kind of started with this idea that I basically just wanted to do a lot more to promote Amicus, which is a relatively new project in the Pro Bono Society. And I was thinking of various ways to do that, and I suddenly realized, why not just turn it into a campaign? I did see whether it would be successful, but I do think that the thing about the death penalty is that it still remains something that is controversial, even up till today. It's that one area of law, and even social ethics, which no one can quite seem to put a pin on it. And why I felt that it would be effective as a campaign, not just to law students or people who are interested in Amicus as a charity, but everyone in general, is the fact that the death penalty touches on so many issues. The more I thought about it and the more I researched into it, I realized that it wasn't just about the death penalty itself, but how we look at legislation that might still actually be quite backwards but exists in our world today. And I felt that my personal belief is that people should always have their own kind of personal activism, constantly debating and discussing things. And I think that's what this campaign is all about, besides the fact that obviously we are promoting awareness about Amicus, a US-based charity that fundraises for lawyers defending prisoners on death row in certain states in America.
Okay, lovely. That's great. Thank you very much, Shobha.
We have with us here today Mr. Alexander Williams of Durham Law School. Mr. Williams is a lecturer and researcher into public law and human rights. He is co-director of the Durham Human Rights Centre and co-convenor of the Civil Liberties Section of the Society of Legal Scholars. Hi, Mr. Williams.
Hello.
So our first question is, how does the death penalty conflict with individual human rights in the UK?
Well, the answer is that it doesn't, really, for the reason that we don't have the death penalty. I'm sure you're aware of that. There is plenty, though, more seriously, plenty to prevent the government from reinstating the death penalty if it wanted to. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, for instance, provides for complete abolition of the death penalty. The European Convention of Human Rights more recently does as well. Its opening gambit, when it was drafted in the 50s, was fairly poor, actually, as far as the death penalty was concerned. Article 2.1, which gives the right to life, expressly preserved, actually, the death penalty for punishment for crime. So if you're convicted of crime, you could be executed constantly with Article 2. That's changed, though, recently. In the 80s, there's Protocol 6, which sought to abolish a death penalty, except for in times of war. And more recently, Protocol 13, which abolishes the death penalty outright, and that's been signed and ratified by the majority of Council of Europe states. So there is plenty there, certainly, to stop the government reinstating the death penalty if, for instance, it wanted to. But it's not just about the right to life, actually. There are other fundamental human rights that the death penalty arguably does conflict with, or would conflict with. One of those, of course, is the right to torture, or the right to freedom from torture, I should say, rather. That, it is obviously a very significant aspect of the death penalty. In states that use the death penalty, prisoners very often spend a very long time on death row before they're executed, and that in itself can amount to something akin to torture. And so that's a very important right, too, that would, as I say, stop the government reinstating the death penalty if hypothetically it wanted to.
If there are so many reasons against having the death penalty, why is it still so prevalent, do you think? I
think, actually, that whilst there is obviously very good reason not to have the death penalty, I think in certain, I'd say, Western states, unanimously, almost unanimously, the view is held that the death penalty is wrong, that it shouldn't be used. But I think actually there are two undertones here which create a great deal of uncertainty. They create some room, not much, but some room for reasonable disagreement about whether the death penalty can and should be used. Ultimately we're talking about criminal justice and how to combat crime. And obviously there's no right way of doing that. Different states, even that are ostensibly fairly similar in terms of their political and social climate, will still have very different outlooks on certain things. And of course the crimes that the death penalty tends to apply to, I mean not always obviously, but tends to apply to the worst, what everyone would agree are the worst kinds of crimes. So, murder, sexual offences, drugs offences as well. The things that nobody would really say don't need combating. And so what we're dealing with is how to combat very serious crime. And as I say, that's something that can lead to a great deal of vehement but nevertheless reasonable disagreement. So I think that's the first strand of this area, this first difficulty really that at least keeps this debate alive. The second is about religious undertones really. I mean, some states that use the death penalty do so because they think that religious doctrine requires it. And once again, that's the kind of situation where very strong views are held. Again, it's not the kind of thing that can be objective as being right or wrong. And that, again, is something that can sow doubt, if you like. It can provide for this reasonable disagreement. And so I'm not saying, obviously, that I think it's arguably the way. My views on the death penalty are very strong. I don't think it's necessary. But nevertheless, I think there's enough there for other states who do use it to say, this is down to us. It's our choice as to whether to use it. And no one has the right to tell us otherwise. So those are the first two. I think there's a third thing, though, the practical problem of just state sovereignty. States who want to use the death penalty, it's very difficult to actually interfere with them, to prevent them from doing that. And so I think those three things combined will keep the death penalty alive.
Countries like the USA are well known for having a very strong rights-based constitution, but they still allow the death penalty. So how do you think they reconcile that with the rights that they provide in their constitution?
I think some of the reasons I gave just now are probably relevant to that, actually. Even though you provide for a right to life, no one will claim that right to life is absolutely sacrosanct. It can be curtailed in certain situations. I mean, even in the UK, for instance, the NHS will make decisions routinely about which treatments to fund and which not to, and the result of that, of course, is that people die. These are the kinds of decisions that have to be made day in, day out. And so a rights-based constitution doesn't necessarily provide for, it doesn't necessarily compel the conclusion that the death penalty is wrong. And I think as well, to add to that, the reason why states will believe, or some states will believe, that they can reconcile the death penalty with a rights-based constitution is because inevitably states being states, and given what their functions are, they will claim that they are acting to protect the rights of others. So whilst people convicted of crimes have a right to life, whilst that might be enough for many people to say the death penalty should be prohibited, nevertheless the state will respond by saying, well, we've got to think about the other people that we're protecting by enforcing the death penalty. And so I think again, there's enough there, I think, for states to say that despite having a rights-based constitution, the death penalty can still, albeit at a push, it can still coexist with that. Yeah.
My next question is with respect to organisations, international organisations like the EU and the Council of Europe. They have a very strong stance against the death penalty, as you said earlier. I mean, you spoke about this a little bit already, but do you think there's enough pressure from the international community, both states and international organisations? Could you just start quickly by giving us a brief overview of what the Council of Europe does? Because I think that's an organisation people don't really know much about, or they confuse it with the EU. So.
Okay, the Council of Europe basically is the group of states that subscribe to the European Convention on Human Rights, at the apex of which sits the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So, when I mentioned, for instance, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, that's something that's very different to the Council of Europe. They're different treaties. They provide, certainly where the death penalty is concerned, very similar things, abolition of the death penalty. But, nevertheless, they are different treaties, even though they overlap in that sense, and also in the sense that many Council of Europe states are also EU members. So back to the question. It is difficult, I think, to know what more could be done. I mean, back to the state sovereignty point that I made a few minutes ago. Yeah. It's very difficult to interfere with a state that insists, for religious or political reasons, on using the death penalty. I think that there is a great amount of work being done, obviously, by international organisations.
Like Amicus.
Like Amicus, yeah, obviously. To put pressure on states who subscribe to the death penalty. But beyond that, and beyond just having more of the same, it's difficult to know what really could be done. So in terms of whether I think there's enough pressure, I'd say certainly wouldn't hurt to have a bit more. But and to link this to the first question, I think this debate will continue. I don't think that it is it's enough of itself really to cause the death penalty to be abolished. I think it will remain for a very long time.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Do you think there needs to be more public awareness about it?
You mean within states that subscribe to the death penalty, or within states that don't?
Or perhaps in states that don't?
I think there's plenty of awareness, in liberal states that don't subscribe to the death penalty, about the evils of the death penalty. Obviously, the US is an exception because, as you said, it's a rights-based constitution that still subscribes to the death penalty in certain states anyway. So I think there's plenty of awareness within states that don't subscribe to the death penalty. Obviously, there's a heightened awareness within states that do subscribe to the death penalty as well. I'm not really sure what more can be done. Everyone knows it's there. Everyone will have an opinion at least on whether it's necessary. And I think other than just continuing to ramp up the pressure, continuing to articulate the reasons why the death penalty shouldn't be used or is unnecessary, it's difficult really to know what more can be done.
It could be argued that many individuals, and especially those in countries that have abolished the death penalty, are quite detached from the issue because it's an issue that almost doesn't concern them. We've sorted it out, we don't have it anymore, so why should it be our problem? Do you think that there should be direct involvement from citizens in countries without the death penalty? And if so, what sort of involvement do you think they should have?
Yeah, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the first part of the question, actually. I think you will find some people who just don't care because it doesn't affect them.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are plenty of those people around. But this is an issue about morality. And a lot of people have strong views on morality, whether the issues in question affect them or not. And so I think people will have a stance on this, whether they're particularly vocal about it or not. Yeah. And so in that sense, there is some involvement by citizens. Lots of people have an opinion on this, or at least will be able to formulate one pretty quickly if they're required to. So in terms of there being direct involvement, I'm not sure, back to what I said earlier, on what kind of form that would take, really, other than perhaps joining organisations like Amicus and showing support that way. I think, as I say, it is an issue on which people have or can certainly conjure up an opinion.
I guess this is a big summary of what we've been talking about. You said earlier that the debate will go on for a long time and the death penalty won't be abolished for a long time. But do you think that we're heading in a direction that somewhere in the future the death penalty will be completely abolished?
Honestly?
Yes.
No, unfortunately I don't. I would like that to happen, obviously. I think many people would. But I think the underlying issues here about morality, about criminal justice, disagreement will rage on those fronts, and I don't see there being an end in sight, really. Only very recently, for instance, as I said at the beginning, did the Council of Europe actually ban the death penalty outright. Protocol 13 was only drawn up in 2002, so only looking a decade ago. In certain European countries, death by firing squad is still being used until the 90s. And so, even in parts of the world where the death penalty is abhorred, the debate continues. So no, I don't. I think that's a pessimistic outlook.
Well, at the same time, we can consider that seeing as all these developments have happened very recently, in the past few decades, that's definitely a positive step towards abolishing it further, around the world.
Absolutely, yeah. It's doing something, I think. But in terms of there being a global abolition of the death penalty, I think we're a very, very long way off that, unfortunately.
I do want to ask, I've noticed that fear is actually a big factor in motivating sort of oppressive legislation. And we have seen, recently with September 11th that we've had, awful control orders and people being detained for prolonged periods of time. So, as you said, there's not much to say that, to disprove the fact that the death penalty could in fact come back to life in a lot of liberal European countries. And in fact, I wanted to point out that Anne Widdecombe, and this was just a few years back when there was a particularly controversial murder case in the UK, actually came forward and said the death penalty should be reinstated in such traumatic events. And it is quite worrying because it does point out to us a fact which even people who are aware of the death penalty often overlook, that a lot of this legislation can in fact come back simply through a traumatic event. And
I think that's a really good point. I think that I mean one of my views certainly in the rights context is that things are unfortunately very rarely as cut and dry as they appear to be, and that our view in Western states that the death penalty should be abolished or should be prohibited only persists within a certain kind of context, a certain political, social context that says we don't need to use the death penalty, and for that reason we can scrap it. And you're right, if something fundamental does change to cause governments to think that actually there might not be a way of combating crime or particular kinds of activity without using it, then that debate is reignited. It's always, well not always, but it's very often, the death penalty does the rounds in tabloid newspapers, for instance. There are petitions saying bring back the death penalty for this, that and the other. And in that sense, even in states where there's a very settled, almost unanimous view that the death penalty should not be used, there are events every now and again that can trigger people to rethink their position. So I think that's a really good point. Essentially the context is very important here. And to tie that back to the question that you asked a few minutes ago about whether I think the death penalty will ever be abolished or will be abolished anytime soon, I mean, that's largely why I don't think it will. We're dealing essentially with very different political, social contexts across the world, and until there is some sort of equalisation between those various contexts, then there will still be very strongly held differences of opinion.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to speak with us today.
No problem.
And Shobha, if you want to tell us just a little bit more about how students at Durham get involved with Amicus.
Sure. Well, there are many ways that you can get involved with Amicus. You don't just have to be part of the project group in the Durham University Pro Bono Society, but you can even simply log on to their website, find out more about them, and obviously this is the difficult part because Amicus is very low on funds. They spend hundreds of hours with lawyers helping them out to get people off death row, and the point is that most of these people on death row are from the lowest rung of society, so they don't really have funds to share to pay for people to come to America and intern with them. However, the internship is definitely worth it, and I think the point stressed here is that America is indeed a whole other world, and most of the people who went on these internships learned a lot in the process, how the American legal system works, and a lot of the difficulties that people face, especially in terms of the surprising amount of discrimination when the law is applied to such states. And also I feel that people can be involved with Amicus in small ways. So with our project, we mostly do fundraising and organizing events. So last year when we first started out, we didn't have a lot of experience to rely on, but we tried to do it in small ways that we could. So we raised money from a bake sale, and we also organized Amicus Formal, which is a significant number of people attended at Trev's College. And I think the point is Amicus really just needs the funds so that the lawyers can go out and do their job. And I think this was made relatively clear by Mark George QC, who is a UK barrister but actually spent quite a significant amount of time in the US defending people on death row. And he was just showing how sort of tragic the state is, really, because a lot of these people on death row have to face going to court with lawyers who are 90 years old, drunk, even deaf, carrying out these sort of joke of a child that you would never imagine happening in a UK court.
Yeah, he told the story about how somebody fell asleep in court, and then when this went to appeal and this was brought up that the lawyer had fallen asleep at first instance, the judge said that it wasn't against the law to fall asleep in court as long as you represented your client. So,
I mean, when you hear about these shocking things, that's when you realize that despite what we said about there existing liberal countries, I mean, America is widely known as a rights-based constitution. Because there's such a strong focus on democracy, it also brings the bad side of democracy that comes with political influences, and a lot of it has to do with election processes and getting votes, etc. So, I think that the best way for people to get involved in Amicus is simply to become more aware and read up a lot more on the death penalty and try and get involved in various campaigns that they've been organizing.
Yeah, and of course Death Penalty Awareness Week. So we have the Amicus Union Society debate on Friday.
Yes, that will feature the UKIP MEP Godfrey Bloom, who will be on proposition, and we have our very own Amicus guest speaker, who is also an intern with Amicus, Fiona Lamb, who is a barrister in the UK.
Great.
So.
Okay, thank you very much, Shobha, and thanks again, Mr. Williams. And thank you for listening to Obiter.